let's talk about what I think could be both the most underrated and most important skill to master in Magic the Gathering, and especially in Commander, and that's threat assessment. I'm going to tell you why it's important, how to get better at it, and why that will lead to more wins and more fun. As always, I'm going to introduce ideas that I hope will change how you think, and that will hopefully make you better at Commander. This video aims to take one from having little to no skill to giving you the tools to become a master, so more experienced players stick with it because I promise it will be worth it as the video progresses. But before we do any of that, we should agree on what exactly threat assessment is. Keeping it as simple as possible, it means being able to read the game state and then judging how close your opponent or opponents are to winning the game so that you can try to stop them. Sounds super simple, right? Well, not exactly. To be able to do this well, you need to understand all the ways that one can win the game. Then understand how this looks in different archetypes and decks. Then understand which of these strategies your opponents are using. And then you need to understand Magic's complex resource system and how this interplays with your opponent's strategies. And last but not least, you need to be able to keep track of all of that in real time so that you can assess who is closest to executing their plan. All of this while one player is crying that they're not the threat despite their Sol Ring start, and another is trying to bargain with you because they'll deal with the Sol Ring player, but in turn you need to not interfere with their next play. And then lastly, one person is quietly watching. See? Super simple, right? As the appetizer before we get to the meat and potatoes of this topic, let's look at why threat assessment is so important. The most obvious is that bad threat assessment loses you the game. If you're grinding ranked on Arena, or you want to win like your life depends on it, then that's obviously something you want to avoid. In Commander, where the stakes are a little lower, you may not care as much about winning, so that's potentially less of a problem. But most of us do, at least to some degree. Threat assessment is a critical underlying skill that affects so much of how one plays a game of Magic. It affects how you make decisions, how you politic, and more importantly, good threat assessment is a buff that doesn't care about how good or bad your decks or draws are. Not accurately understanding or judging situations can see you using critical limited resources like removal on the wrong targets, either kicking someone while they're down or king-making another player who's already way ahead. Beyond losing you the game, the much bigger issue this creates, especially in Commander, is bad vibes. Everyone sits down to play hoping they'll get, as they say in Australia, a fair shake of the sauce bottle. If and when that doesn't happen, even if it's by accident, it can feel pretty bad. It's this social element that makes threat assessment one of the most important skills to master to ensure that you and your friends leave a Commander game happy rather than frustrated. Being able to assess threats reasonably well is thus a responsibility that each of us carries when we sit down to play a game. You wouldn't show up to your doubles tennis match without a racket, and not mastering threat assessment has a very similar effect on unbalancing and potentially ruining the games of Commander that you're in. Doing this badly is thus a disservice to the table and the people you're playing with. It's not surprising that for this reason, threat assessment ability, or the lack of it, is the bane of new players everywhere. It's hard enough trying to remember how to play the game at all, let alone when your friend is shouting at you because you removed their card, which was apparently the only way to keep a problematic player in check, and now they're about to run away with the game. And whilst new players almost certainly deal with the challenges that threat assessment poses more often, I would argue that most more experienced Commander players are probably not as good at it as they think they are. But fear not, your friendly neighborhood card-wielding frog is here to help, and make you a master threat assessor. And we'll start with the foundation of this threat assessment castle, understanding how a player can win the game. There are three main game strategies in Magic. Aggressive, combat-focused ones, or aggro, slower ones that aim to control the game and gain resource advantage over time, or control, and then aggressive and non-combat focused ones that aim to assemble a combination of cards that allow one to win the game on the spot, or combo. The most common way someone is going to win, especially at lower power brackets, is aggro, and that's using their creatures to pound your life total down to 0. Typically, combat damage focused decks will either go wide and try to overwhelm you with many creatures, or they'll go tall and provide a beatdown with fewer bigger creatures. Another variation of decks that go tall in Commander is decks that rely on a Voltron strategy, and they pump up their Commander to deal 21 Commander damage. Decks that shun turning creatures sideways, like combo or control decks, will usually win by either whittling you down, or by using big flashy spells, or by using infinite combos. These decks will either try to go very fast to win before your creatures can do their thing, or they'll disrupt and slow the game down to give them time to find the cards that they need to win. The list of possible spells and or exact win conditions is way too long to go through here, and the best way for you to get more familiar with them is to get out there and lose some games of Magic the Gathering. That said, let's take a look at some of the more popular commanders and how they interact with these win conditions so that you get a sense of what to watch out for. Kadira, Caller of the Small, wants to go very wide and overwhelm you with many, and I mean many, rabbits. If you're losing to a commander like Kadira, it's probably because there are about 20 creatures that you can't block, which are hopefully 1/1s, but will quite possibly be much bigger. Other popular commanders like this are Edgar Markov, Krenko, or Lathril. On the flip side, Pantlaza is one of the most popular commanders and falls very much into the tall combat damage category. The deck wants to overwhelm you with big scary dinosaurs that are hard to deal with. If this deck is going to kill you, it'll be because you're on the receiving end of a handful of very big boys, some of which have been cheated into play, and most of which will have very problematic abilities. This will be true for other similar commanders like the Ur-Dragon, Giada, Kalia, or Julidok. Skullbriar is a great example of the Voltron side of tall combat damage strategy. The deck wants to play a commander and then find all manner of supportive cards to make them big, scary, and hard to block. This aggressive strategy aims to kill you before you can kill them, and if you're dying to them, it's probably because they've thwarted your attempts to disrupt them and have managed to get up to some tricky explosive shenanigans. Commanders like Wolverine, Rafik, and Lightpaws are other great examples, with special shoutouts for favorites of mine that I've done videos about in John Benton and Lise. When it comes to combat-averse strategies, Dina Soulsleeper is a great example of aristocrat control strategies. She's going to sit back, dealing death by 1,000 cuts that feels a lot like slowly sinking into quicksand. If you're losing to her, it's either because they've assembled a fearsome engine of pinging, or you've left them alone for too long to drain and ping you constantly. In the case of Dina, by gaining life in small increments and slowly whittling you down. Ilasil Kor, Campbell Profiteering Mayor, and Tessa Karlov are other good examples of commanders like this. Whilst not identical, commanders like Nekusar, Barbara Saga, and Lord of Pain, and even Gerston Stan are similar enough in how they operate to belong in this category too. Gerston Stan's game plan shares a lot of similarities with slower, more controlling decks, but in contrast, a commander like Galazith Mizmari typically aims to control the game much more until it ends the game with the huge flashy spell like a Jaya's Immolating Inferno in a single turn. This category of decks is pretty broad, but the core similarities are a commander and game plan that can't win the game very quickly, but given time, can control the game enough to gain a resource advantage and then take a huge turn where they cast a game-winning spell. What kind of spell this is will depend on the deck and commander, but think of spells like Insurrection, Rise of the Dark Realms, Torrent of Hailfire, or Rise and Shine. Other commanders that fit this category are Eluge, Urza, Hilda of the Icy Crown, and Alila Cunning Conqueror. And last but not least, there are the combo decks. Stellar Lee is a great example of this. This type of deck aims to accelerate into its win conditions as fast as possible. They tend to have very little board presence and are fairly all or nothing in their playstyle. If you lose to them, it'll be because they've assembled their combo pieces and managed to push them through any possible disruption and win on the spot. There are many different combos in Commander, but to give you two examples, in Stellar Lee, you use Twisted Fealty to infinitely untap her, making infinite copies of Twisted Fealty and infinitely draining the table of 1 life. Or if you're playing a graveyard deck like Tival the Balanced Scale, you may have a Blood Artist, Phyrexian Altar, and Gravecrawler, allowing you to infinitely recycle a Gravecrawler, dealing 1 damage every time you do. Other well-known combo commanders are Niv Mizzet, Chatterfang, or pretty much any CDH commander, like Kinnan or Crom and Timna. Combos that win the game on the spot are probably some of the trickiest threats you're going to face in Commander. Because while some decks are built as combo decks and look like it, many decks that look like they're go-wide decks or perhaps aristocrat decks can and will include infinite combos, especially if you're playing at bracket 3 or above. It's for this reason that being able to spot which strategies or win conditions your opponent are likely using is critically important, and more on that in a second. If you're enjoying this, I make videos like this that help you think differently about Magic and Commander. Videos that will help you build better decks, play better, and have more fun. If you want more of that, like the video and subscribe to the channel to tell the algorithm gods that you think it's good, and so that YouTube delivers my next banger directly into your eyeballs. Okay, now that we're aligned on the basics of how players can win, let's look at how to know which of those strategies your opponents are likely using. The first way is simply to look at their commanders. Because much like reading the card explains the card, reading the commander often explains the strategy, and most players will pick a commander that strongly synergizes with or enables a certain type of strategy. The second way is by paying attention to the bracket that you're playing in. If you're in bracket 2, you probably need to worry less about combos and more about dying to combat damage or a big flashy spell. But as you move up the brackets, the prevalence of combo-driven wins increases, and the chance of dying to combat damage lessens. If you're sitting down for a game and you've read your opponent's commanders and have absolutely no idea what their game plan is, ask them. Remember that you owe it to the table to be able to assess threats well, so your opponents should owe it to you to explain roughly what their deck does as part of pre-game conversations. This is, after all, why pre-game chats exist, to set up a good and fair game. Even if your opponents don't want to tell you in detail what they're going to be doing, telling you roughly what their strategy is, like Voltron, aggro, or combo, and things like whether or not they run infinite combos should be very acceptable. Outside of CDH, which is understandably different, If players are getting defensive and don't want to tell you what their plans are, send them my way and I'll take a lily pad to their kneecaps to teach them some manners. Okay, let's get to the real juice of threat assessment. Understanding Magic's complex resource system and how this interplays with your opponent's routes to victory. If a player is going to win a game of Magic, they need to progress along their pre-planned strategy and path to winning. Some decks are far more linear in their progression, and it's a bit easier for us to judge how far along their game plan they are. Some are far more explosive and seem to take 2 or 3 steps at a time, making them far more difficult to read. Regardless, there is usually a point of no return in an opponent's game plan where it becomes too late to stop their victory snowball. Threat assessment done well is about judging how long you can leave that opponent in question alone and focus on your own game plan before they get to that tipping point. Timing exactly how and when you intervene is the secret sauce to becoming a master at threat assessment. It sounds fairly simple, but the sheer number of things you have to take into account make it not so simple at all. And even more so when you're doing this for 3 players who are all simultaneously racing towards Commander Climax. With everything we've covered so far in mind, timing this to perfection comes down to one key thing: resources. Monitoring both visible resources in play and then predicting unseen or possible resources or variables is how you will know whether an opponent is likely a level 1 crook or a level 100 boss. So let's look at some of the resources and variables you need to keep track of. The first is mana. This video focuses more on you hindering your opponents than your opponents hindering you, so the core focus is on how much mana they will likely have to do unspeakable proactive things to win the game on their next turn. This is different for each deck, but at bracket 3 and below, you probably need to start paying attention if opponents have the ability to cast multiple stronger spells in a turn, and the 6 mana threshold is likely that point. This means that in most cases, you probably don't need to stress too much before turn 5, but you do need to take into account how much someone has ramped. Because if they've ramped on turns 2 and 3 and untapped with 7 mana on turn 4, they may present a big problem. We will come back to board state in more detail, but in many decks, especially aggro decks, which non-land permanents they have in play also has a big impact on their threat level here, because if an aggro deck has 8 mana available on turn 5, but they have little to no creatures in play, they probably need a turn to set up and play creatures before they can empower them to really provide much of a threat. Something else to bear in mind is a player's ability to set up at instant speed before they untap. If players have a way of casting spells at instant speed, you need to be aware of their mana and ability to make powerful proactive plays before they untap. This could be more mana, broken synergy pieces, or even one-sided board wipes. But far more likely is them drawing a bunch of cards or casting proactive interaction to set up for a turn where they can be more threatening. Speaking of cards, this happens to be the next resource. Simply put, cards win games, because those cards turn into more mana, threats, and removal. And in the vast majority of cases, the player who draws the most cards across a game likely has the best shot of winning. And cards are a tricky resource, because unlike something like creatures, how many cards your opponent has in hand isn't as in your face or obvious, so you can and should proactively be keeping track of how many cards your opponents have access to at all times. But that's only half the battle, because if your opponent's playing a graveyard deck, their 25 card strong graveyard is basically an extension of their hand. And then you realize that the player who currently has 7 cards in hand has actually drawn another 15 cards across the game and discarded them, and they have a cherry-picked hand of 7 of the most finely curated cards that are almost certainly about to catapult them to a win. Newer players often focus far too much on board presence and too little on these less shouty elements. An aggro player with 4 creatures will often look far more threatening than a control deck with none. But that aggro player has 1 card in hand and the control deck has 7, and after the control player board wipes, which is quite likely, the resource balance and balance of power in the game will have shifted dramatically. They're not locked in here with you, it's you that's locked in here with them. This is a very common occurrence, where a player flies under the radar and quietly amasses tons of resources while your attention has been focused somewhere else. Expect the power and primary threat to flow between different players in a game, and don't get too focused on only one, or it will likely put you in a bad spot. Biases make your life even harder here, creating all kinds of traps and ruining your ability to think clearly and logically. If you want to learn more about that, go and watch my video about it, linked in the description. This situation with card advantage is a great example of another way that keeping track of resources can be tricky, and that's comparing immediate effects versus effects over time. When a player plays a spell that has a large immediate impact, like a board wipe or a big scary creature, it sends our threat detection into overdrive. It's also quite easy to measure the direct effect that has on resource advantage. Quite often, however, when a player plays a spell that instead creates incremental, less in your face value, it can often fly under the radar until that seemingly less scary or impactful card has actually created far more value than its in-your-face counterpart. One of my favorite examples of this is a card like Pantlaza. As an immediate threat, a 4/4 for 5 mana that's probably going to get you a ramp spell or a small dinosaur doesn't seem particularly scary, but getting an extra card every time you play a dinosaur is pretty powerful, especially over multiple turns. And Pantlaza makes that even worse by making those cards free to play. The next turn, that player could cast a Pugnacious Hammerskull and discover into a Wrathful Raptors, and the next turn, they could cast the Ghalta Primal Hunger and discover into a Gishath, and suddenly the table's in all kinds of trouble. That free stuff part of her ability is another prime example of less in-your-face resource advantage that you should be watching like a hawk. If you cast your mind back to my point about players casting multiple spells a turn and that 6 mana threshold, getting to cast spells for free or getting free mana puts players in this danger zone much more quickly, and especially if this ability, like on Pantlaza, allows that player to gain this free advantage over and over again. Okay, let's bring the focus back to more visible resources and talk about board states and specifically non-land permanents. For the most part, if you know what type of deck your opponent is playing and thus know their general strategy, then I think this is actually the easiest part of threat assessment. You're basically looking out for clearly problematic cards that support what they're trying to do. Where this does get tricky is deciding how long you leave someone alone before you try to disrupt their plans, and how exactly you do attempt to get in the way when you do. Let's start with revisiting the how and how we handle the different types of strategies, and we'll finish with some of the intricacies around the when. The best way to deal with go wide decks is to keep their number of creatures in check, either by destroying them or preventing them from building a large board state in the first place. A go wide deck that fails to go wide isn't much of a threat at all, and you'll see their win coming a turn or two out. For go tall decks, it's more about stopping those key problematic creatures and stopping those creatures from synergizing with each other by using single target removal on the biggest problems before you get a 1+1=11 situation. It's only when a go tall deck has multiple pieces of the synergy puzzle in play that you really have to begin to worry. For most Voltron strategies, it's all about the amount of support pieces they have in play and all the mana available to play more. A Voltron commander by itself usually isn't much of a threat. You typically want to deal with them and slow them down before they have some form of protection and or before they attack, because if they're attacking, it probably means they've got instant speed protection. A Voltron deck without its commander in play, or without a bunch of support pieces in play to make their commander scary, or without the mana to play all of those things at once, is not really something you have to worry about. When it comes to control decks, they generally aren't going to have as many permanents to worry about, so instead, punch them in the face. They want the game to go longer, so they can amass more resources and play their big powerful spells more proactively, so putting them on low life makes it much harder for them to stabilize, and it means that it's much easier for you or another player to deal with them later if they start looking threatening. Because your only way to deal with them is to kill them. Control decks typically win at sorcery speed, so if they're on low life, you probably have the luxury to leave them alone for a bit. But a control deck going to turn 6 or beyond on 35 or more life is a recipe for disaster. And finally, combo decks. Combo decks are almost identical to control decks with 2 exceptions. Firstly, punch them in the face and don't stop till they die. Because while control decks want to win late, combo decks just want to seem less threatening, fly under the radar, and win as early as possible. Then secondly, if you fail to kill them fast enough, you will need to interact with them on the turn they try and combo out, and will need the required spells and untapped mana to do so. Unless you have a really good reason not to, always kill the combo player first, because their decks accelerate into a win the fastest, and usually in a single turn, so they have the ability to win out of nowhere. Their wins are often the hardest to see coming because of this, and thus the only good combo player is a dead combo player. Okay, it's time for the final boss, the when. In truth, we've already started talking about the when a long time ago, as everything we've covered so far will help you assess how much of a problem someone is at any point in time. Your job now is to implement this and practice asking the right questions, monitoring the game state, and making educated guesses. But unless you're some kind of psycho, you will likely only have limited disruption in your deck and will likely draw 2 or 3 across the entire game. This means you probably want to hold back on actually using your interaction until you really have to. Overestimating how much of a problem someone is can often see you be trigger happy with your removal, only to have no way of dealing with the real threats when they arise. Many a game of Commander has been decided because players have burned all their removal on the current seemingly strongest player, only for someone else to rise from the shadows and win shortly after, because the players in the game fell into a trap of only judging what's right in front of them and not the bigger picture. Even if one does look beyond the obvious, sometimes you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because 2 players are both looking particularly scary. At that point, it comes back to resources and a judgment call taking into account who's more important to deal with, and the power and interaction vacuum that's created by engaging them. Learning where exactly that tipping point is requires some practical experience at something I mentioned earlier that we should all be doing fairly often, and that's losing. You get far more data and learn far more from a game where you let your opponent do their thing for too long and don't interact in time than you do from a game where you interact too early. The very best way to train this is to play more traditional 60 or 40 card Magic formats, especially if you're new to Magic and started playing via Commander. The defined metas, the immediate impacts of your decisions you make, and the tight feedback loop given faster games all allow you to test, make mistakes, and learn, and then put those lessons into action at a rate much higher than you'd get while playing Commander. In Commander though, make sure you play all the types of decks, because playing a certain strategy will make you far more intimately aware of what that deck wants to do, and when, and what its weaknesses are. That'll make it far more easy for you to spot the pivotal moments in their strategy where you should be getting in the way. One important thing we haven't talked about is cards that can rapidly move an opponent along their planned strategy and make them leapfrog 2 or 3 steps at a time. Typically, any card that can instantly generate a lot of resources or be cast for free fits the bill. These spells break the cadence of the game and are able to catapult a player ahead in a burst. That includes, but isn't limited to, cards like Sol Ring, Dark Ritual, Jeska's Will, and Fierce Guardianship. Beyond these universally good cards are also situational cards that can rapidly change the dynamic of or warp a game. For example, in an aggro deck, but especially in go tall creature decks, cards that give creatures haste mean that opponents' turns can be far more explosive. And that's even worse when they have a card like Sneak Attack. An empty board could become a major threat for a handful of mana. Another example in Voltron decks are cards that can multiply damage output and can rapidly cause a fairly small commander to become a lethal problem in only a few cards in mana. The most common of these will be cards that double power, give double strike, or double counters. In a control deck, a card like the One Ring that gives the control player an entire turn cycle to set up a winning board state is equally game warping, and even worse if they're able to bounce and replay it, creating a lock. This has been pretty long already, so I'll try to wrap this up. The last point I'll make is that Magic is incredibly complicated, and even for the most experienced players, there are tons of variables to keep track of. It's truly one of those situations where the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know. But if every turn cycle on your opponent's turns, instead of getting distracted, yapping, or planning your own turn, you do a few quick checks to keep track of critical things, like each player's board state and their resources, it'll be much easier to judge which players are or are about to become problematic. I think you'll be really surprised if you pay close attention to the game state about how wrong some of your assumptions may have been in the past, and about how you may have been under or overestimating the threat that your opponents have posed at any point in time. I hope you found this useful, and if anything in particular was a light bulb moment for you, drop it in the comments so others can spot it in case they missed it. Also, let me know if you have a take about threat assessment that I haven't included. As always, thanks for being here, and a reminder that I've got a Discord full of very base people if you're looking for a positive, wholesome place to talk about Magic.